The quiet neighborhood had always been a place where people knew their neighbors, where lawns were carefully maintained and where every street looked almost identical, lined with neat houses and flowering gardens. Life here moved at a slow and predictable pace, and residents took pride in keeping everything orderly. But underneath that calm surface, small tensions often simmered. People had unspoken rivalries and minor grudges, and occasionally, conflicts would arise over trivial matters that seemed bigger than they were. One morning, the peace was about to be disrupted by an unexpected confrontation that no one in the neighborhood would forget. On this particular morning, a 76-year-old veteran was enjoying his usual routine. He had risen early, brewed his coffee, and settled into his favorite chair on the front porch. The sun was just starting to warm the neighborhood, birds were chirping, and the veteran could hear the distant hum of traffic on the main road. He liked these quiet moments, reflecting on the years he had lived and the experiences he had gathered, both in service to his country and in his personal life. Discipline and patience were his guiding principles, qualities honed over decades of facing challenges with calm determination. He sipped his coffee slowly, feeling the warmth and the comfort of routine, when a sudden disturbance caught his attention. A woman from down the street, known among neighbors for her strict attitude and obsession with rules, had noticed something she deemed inappropriate. Her reputation in the community was well known. She was the type who would call out neighbors for minor infractions, send letters demanding compliance with rules, and insist on personal authority over situations that rarely required it. She saw herself as the guardian of order, though her behavior often caused more friction than harmony. Without hesitation, she pulled out her phone and dialed the police. She claimed that the veteran was violating homeowners association rules, though in truth there was no real problem. She was convinced she was enforcing the law and maintaining the community's standards. What she did not know, however, was the veteran's background. To most, he was simply an elderly man who had served his country and now enjoyed the quiet life of retirement. Few could imagine that he was someone with significant influence, someone who had helped shape and oversee hundreds of HOAs across the nation. His knowledge of rules, governance, and fairness was extensive, and he had spent years ensuring that communities operated with integrity and justice. The police arrived quickly, responding to the complaint. 2 officers stepped onto the sidewalk, looking cautious but polite. The veteran stood up, straightening his posture. His military background was evident in the way he carried himself, calm, confident, and composed. He greeted the officers with a friendly nod and a warm tone, answering their questions without a trace of irritation. His voice was steady, measured, and calm, reflecting the patience of someone who had dealt with far more challenging situations than a neighborhood complaint. The woman, on the other hand, was already frustrated. She had expected immediate action in her favor, perhaps some reprimand for the veteran. Instead, she was met with a man who was unflappable, courteous, and well-prepared. She realized slowly that this would not be the simple victory she had imagined. The officers asked a few routine questions, glanced at the surrounding area, and after a brief discussion with the veteran, concluded that there was no violation occurring. They left, leaving the woman fuming and embarrassed. She returned home muttering to herself, convinced that the veteran was in the wrong and that she had somehow been cheated by the system. But the veteran remained calm. He went back to his chair on the porch, picked up his coffee, and resumed his morning routine as if nothing had happened. He understood that some people acted out of habit, insecurity, or a need to assert control, and he had learned long ago that reacting with anger only escalated problems. While the immediate confrontation had ended, the woman's efforts did not stop there. She began sending letters to the veteran, making threats of fines and penalties that had no legal basis. She posted notes about alleged infractions, expecting neighbors to side with her. But this only set in motion a series of events that she could not have foreseen. The veteran, with his extensive experience, knew how to handle such situations. He documented everything, keeping careful records of her complaints and the evidence that showed she was wrong. He understood the value of patience, of building a case with facts rather than emotions. Neighbors began to notice the tension. Some had witnessed the woman's aggressive behavior over the years and were quietly sympathetic to the veteran. Others had no idea about his background but were intrigued by how calmly he handled the situation. Rumors began to circulate, not of wrongdoing on his part, but of the veteran's past. Stories emerged about his military service, his dedication to helping communities manage their homeowners associations, and his reputation for fairness and wisdom, people started to realize that this was not just an ordinary resident. He was someone with knowledge, authority, and influence that extended far beyond their street. The veteran, meanwhile, continued to live his life as he always had. He spent his mornings on the porch, tended his garden with care, and interacted with neighbors politely. He never boasted about his accomplishments or authority. To him, respect was earned through actions, not claimed through threats or intimidation. He observed the neighborhood with a keen eye, noticing patterns, understanding dynamics, and preparing for what might come next without letting it disturb his peace. The woman, oblivious to his background and influence, continued her campaign of complaints. She called meetings, tried to persuade other neighbors to support her, and even attempted to involve the HOA board she thought she controlled. But her efforts only revealed her arrogance and misunderstanding of the veteran's reach. He had connections with HOA boards nationwide, had helped write regulations, and understood the limits of authority better than anyone. While she was focused on trying to assert control in a small neighborhood, he had the perspective and power to influence outcomes in ways she could not imagine. Neighbors started taking sides quietly. Some admired the veteran's calm approach, appreciating how he handled the harassment without losing his composure. Others were curious, observing how someone could be so respected without ever demanding attention. The neighborhood, usually quiet and predictable, had begun to stir with the tension of an unexpected confrontation, and the story of the veteran and the woman became a topic of whispered conversation and cautious observation. Despite the challenges, the veteran did not act out of anger or revenge. He relied on the systems he understood, the networks he had built, and the facts he had gathered. He knew that people who acted impulsively often faced consequences, while those who remained calm and methodical could resolve conflicts effectively. His military training had taught him the importance of strategy, patience, and measured responses, lessons he applied not on the battlefield, but in the quiet streets of his neighborhood. As the days passed, the woman's attempts to assert control began to backfire. The more she pushed, the more she exposed her own behavior to scrutiny. Letters were documented, complaints were recorded, and her reputation among neighbors started to shift. People who had once feared her began to see the veteran in a new light, recognizing his fairness, patience, and quiet authority. He had turned a potential confrontation into an opportunity to demonstrate integrity and wisdom, proving that respect and influence came from knowledge, action, and composure rather than threats and aggression. The veteran's life, although touched by unexpected conflict, remained rooted in routine, kindness, and quiet strength. He tended to his garden, shared small moments with neighbors, and continued his morning coffees on the porch. Yet beneath the surface he was preparing, not for retaliation but for measured steps that would ensure fairness, justice, and community harmony. He understood that true authority was not about dominance, but about knowledge, patience, and the ability to act decisively when the time was right. In this quiet neighborhood, a simple morning disturbance had set in motion events that would change the way people saw power, respect, and the difference between arrogance and wisdom. By the end of the first week, the veteran had already begun to take subtle actions. He reached out to a few HOA boards, ensuring they were aware of the woman's pattern of harassment. He documented her complaints meticulously, noting each false claim and unnecessary threat. He did not confront her directly yet, but he had positioned himself strategically. Anyone watching closely could see that he was calm, prepared, and deliberate. His influence was not loud or boastful, but it was undeniable to those who understood the system and his role within it. The neighborhood remained tense, but it was a different tension now, one of anticipation and curiosity. People wondered what would happen next, and those with insight began to recognize that this veteran was no ordinary resident. He had seen challenges, managed conflicts, and built networks that gave him an understanding of power that most people never experienced. And while the woman continued her attempts to control and intimidate, she was stepping into a situation far beyond her comprehension. The veteran's calm demeanor, his careful observation, and his strategic planning were slowly turning. After the initial confrontation, life for the veteran seemed to return to its usual rhythm, but the undercurrents of tension in the neighborhood were far from over. The woman, determined to assert control, escalated her efforts. She began sending a steady stream of letters and emails, claiming that the veteran was violating HOA rules that were either outdated or did not apply to his property. Her messages were filled with threats of fines, police involvement, and formal complaints to the board. She believed that if she was persistent enough, she could wear him down. What she did not realize was that she was now engaging with someone who had experience far beyond the local level. The veteran was not just a homeowner. He had spent decades helping manage and guide hundreds of homeowners associations across the country. He understood rules, their intent, and how to enforce them fairly. He did not react impulsively. Instead, he began documenting every incident meticulously. Every letter, every threat, every attempt at intimidation was logged with dates, times, and details. He photographed the notes and kept a digital record, ensuring that nothing could be disputed later. This was not just caution. It was preparation. The veteran knew that the system worked in favor of those who had facts, patience, and persistence. He also knew that most conflicts could be resolved without confrontation if approached methodically. For him, anger would only cloud judgment, and retaliation would distract from the larger goal, maintaining fairness and protecting not just himself, but also the community from unnecessary disruption. Meanwhile, neighbors were beginning to notice the ongoing dispute. Some had been quietly observing the woman for years, aware of her tendency to overstep boundaries. Others were newly aware of the tension because of the visible back and forth between her and the veteran. Conversations started to change subtly. People who had been neutral or fearful began discussing the situation privately, noticing how calmly the veteran handled each situation. They saw a man who listened carefully, responded thoughtfully, and never raised his voice, in stark contrast to the woman's escalating aggressiveness. This quiet admiration began to spread, even if some neighbors were not yet sure what exactly had given him such authority. The veteran decided to reach out to the broader HOA network quietly, informing several boards about the pattern of harassment. He did this not as an act of threat, but as a precaution. He knew that many HOA boards respected experience and knowledge, and his insight was often sought in complicated situations. By alerting the boards, he ensured that the woman's actions could be addressed if they became part of a larger pattern. This also demonstrated his understanding of governance. He respected the system enough to work within it, rather than simply reacting on a personal level. He was methodical, strategic, and careful, qualities that had served him well throughout his life. The woman, unaware of his background and influence, continued to press her claims. She attempted to rally other neighbors, calling informal meetings and spreading rumors about alleged infractions. She wanted to paint the veteran as someone who ignored rules and sought to undermine community standards. However, the neighbors she approached were met with inconsistencies in her story and could see her growing frustration. The more she pressed, the more her credibility declined. Observing this, the veteran did not gloat or intervene directly. Instead, he continued to document each action and prepare for the appropriate moment when the truth would make itself clear to everyone. Tension built quietly over the weeks. The veteran spent time talking with neighbors individually, not to spread gossip but to answer questions and clarify rules. He explained that misunderstandings about HOA regulations were common, and that fair application of rules required careful attention and impartial judgment. His calm demeanor and willingness to explain rather than argue drew people toward him. Slowly, the narrative of the veteran as a fair, patient, and knowledgeable figure began to solidify. The woman's attempts at intimidation were increasingly recognized for what they were: efforts driven by ego rather than fairness. Meanwhile, the veteran also focused on maintaining his own property to the highest standards. He tended his garden, mowed the lawn, and kept the house in pristine condition. By continuing his routine and showing respect for the community's guidelines, he provided a stark contrast to the woman's behavior, which was marked by exaggeration and attempts to enforce personal whims. It became increasingly evident to neighbors that he was not only compliant with the rules, but also someone who understood them better than most. This quiet demonstration of responsibility reinforced his credibility, making it difficult for anyone to challenge his position on principle. The veteran also began to prepare for potential formal meetings or board interventions. He reviewed HOA bylaws, checked local and national precedents, and consulted with trusted colleagues from his HOA network. He anticipated that the woman might try to take the dispute to official channels, and he wanted to be ready. But preparation, in his view, was not about confrontation. It was about ensuring that fairness and truth prevailed. His experience had taught him that those who acted with patience and strategy rarely lost when the facts were on their side. As the woman escalated, attempting to file formal complaints with the HOA board, the veteran submitted his documented records, clearly showing her pattern of harassment and baseless claims. He included copies of letters, photos, and records of prior behavior that illustrated her disregard for the actual rules. The board, many members of which he had advised in the past, reviewed the materials carefully. His reputation for integrity and clarity carried weight, and they immediately recognized the merit of his documentation. The woman's complaints began to lose credibility quickly, leaving her frustrated and increasingly isolated. During this time, neighbors started to take note of the veteran's approach. They admired how he handled a potentially volatile situation without losing his composure. Parents who had observed the interactions with concern were reassured that the veteran's experience and wisdom protected the community from unfair behavior. Children playing nearby would sometimes see him tending his garden or quietly discussing issues with neighbors, unaware of the larger influence he wielded, but learning subtly that calm, thoughtful action often had the most impact. The neighborhood itself began to feel a shift in energy. Respect, patience, and fairness were quietly taking precedence over aggression and intimidation. The woman, realizing that her tactics were failing, attempted another approach. She started looking for any minor mistake she could accuse him of, hoping to finally gain some leverage. But the veteran, having anticipated such behavior, had already ensured that everything about his property, conduct, and interactions complied fully with the rules. Her attempts to create a conflict where none existed only highlighted her overreach. Each failed attempt weakened her position and strengthened the perception that the veteran's calm, methodical approach was both wise and fair. One afternoon, she tried to create a scene at a neighborhood gathering, loudly accusing him of ignoring regulations. The veteran did not respond with anger or defensiveness. Instead, he calmly presented the facts, referencing the HOA rules and demonstrating clearly that he had followed them meticulously. Neighbors who had seen her pattern of exaggeration and intimidation over weeks could immediately see the disparity. Some quietly expressed support for the veteran, while others simply observed, realizing that the truth was undeniable. The confrontation ended without drama, but the woman's credibility had taken another blow. Behind the scenes, the veteran continued to strengthen his position. He reached out to a few other HOA boards for guidance on ensuring fair resolution and documenting ongoing behavior. These communications were professional, factual, and focused on maintaining harmony within the neighborhood. They reflected not a desire for revenge, but a commitment to fairness and community well-being. His strategic actions ensured that any further escalation by the woman would be addressed efficiently and effectively, leaving her little room to maneuver. By the end of the month, the neighborhood atmosphere had changed. The veteran had not only defended himself, but also subtly reinforced the importance of fairness, patience, and knowledge in maintaining community standards. Neighbors now recognized the difference between someone who acted out of ego and someone who acted with experience and integrity. The woman, increasingly frustrated and isolated, found it harder to rally support. Her attempts at intimidation had not only failed, but it also highlighted the veteran's skill in handling complex situations with calm authority. The veteran's life, despite the ongoing conflict, remained rooted in routine, discipline, and quiet engagement with the community. He continued to spend mornings on his porch, tended his garden, and engaged neighbors with thoughtful conversations. Yet his influence grew in the background, built not on threats or loud declarations but on patience, clarity, and an unwavering commitment to fairness. The neighborhood began to see that real power did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it moved quietly, with intelligence and strategy, and left a lasting impact on everyone around it. Through careful observation, methodical action, and a steadfast commitment to integrity, the veteran had already started to turn the situation in his. Weeks passed and the tension in the neighborhood remained, though it had begun to shift. The woman, frustrated by her inability to sway opinions or enforce her imagined authority, became more desperate. She tried to organize neighborhood meetings, hoping to publicly challenge the veteran and rally support for her side. She thought that if she could make it appear that he was violating rules, others would join her. What she did not realize was that the veteran had already prepared. He knew that evidence and calm reasoning were far more powerful than loud accusations. He had meticulously documented her repeated attempts at harassment, recording dates, incidents, and all correspondence. He had proof that her actions were motivated more by ego than fairness, and he was ready to present it if needed. When the meeting began, the atmosphere was tense. Neighbors gathered in the small community room, unsure of what to expect. The woman took her place at the front, determined to present her case with confidence. She spoke loudly, trying to emphasize the veteran's supposed mistakes, and called for enforcement of rules she claimed he had broken. Some residents were uncomfortable, unsure who was right, while others had quietly been observing her behavior over time and were skeptical. The veteran, calm and composed, listened carefully. He did not interrupt or react emotionally. Instead, he waited for the right moment to respond, understanding that measured words carried more weight than interruptions or anger. When it was his turn to speak, he presented his side of the story clearly and methodically. He referred to specific HOA rules, explained the intent behind them, and demonstrated with evidence that he had followed every guideline. He showed the documentation he had gathered, including letters, photos, and timelines of the woman's repeated complaints. Each piece of evidence was factual and straightforward, leaving no room for doubt. He did not attack the woman personally, instead focusing on the facts and the importance of fairness in applying rules. His calm demeanor and precise explanations quickly drew attention. People who had been unsure began to see a clear contrast between his careful approach and the woman's aggressive, often exaggerated claims. As the veteran spoke, the mood in the room began to change. Neighbors who had once been curious or hesitant now listened intently, impressed by his knowledge and patience. They noticed that he spoke not to dominate the conversation, but to inform and clarify. He emphasized community well-being over personal gain, and demonstrated how rules were meant to maintain harmony, not to be used as a weapon. The woman, who had expected applause and support, began to falter. Her voice grew louder and more strained, and her points started to seem less convincing compared to the veteran's calm, clear presentation. After he finished, there was a moment of silence. The room seemed to recognize the disparity. People could see that the veteran had acted with integrity, while the woman's repeated attempts at intimidation were transparent. A few neighbors quietly expressed agreement, validating his points. Others, who had been unsure before, now realized that the situation had been misrepresented and that the veteran had been unfairly targeted. Even those who had once been neutral started to appreciate the veteran's calm authority and strategic thinking. He had managed to turn a potentially tense confrontation into a demonstration of leadership and fairness. Following the meeting, the HOA board took notice. They reviewed the documentation and the accounts from neighbors, confirming that the veteran had acted appropriately. The woman's complaints were dismissed, and she was reminded of the proper procedures for addressing concerns in the community. The board emphasized that harassment or intimidation would not be tolerated, and that all residents were expected to follow the rules respectfully. This official recognition further strengthened the veteran's position. He had not sought revenge or public attention. He had simply relied on facts, patience, and fairness, and the system had supported him. In the days that followed, the neighborhood atmosphere began to improve. The woman's influence waned as residents recognized her repeated attempts to assert control without justification. The veteran continued his daily routines, tending his garden, enjoying his morning coffee, and engaging in polite conversation with neighbors. Yet beneath this calm exterior, he remained aware of the situation, ready to address any further issues with the same strategic patience. He understood that true influence came not from anger or force, but from knowledge, preparation, and the ability to act decisively when needed. Neighbors began to see him differently. They appreciated his quiet leadership and the way he handled a challenging situation without conflict. Children who played nearby noticed his consistent routines and polite interactions, learning subtle lessons about patience, fairness, and respect. Adults began seeking his advice on small community matters, recognizing that his experience and judgment were valuable beyond this particular dispute. The veteran had become a quiet authority in the neighborhood, respected not because he demanded it, but because he earned it through consistent, thoughtful action. Meanwhile, the woman struggled to regain any semblance of control. Her attempts to spread rumors or rally support fell flat, as neighbors had witnessed her aggressive behavior and recognized the veteran's fair handling of the situation. Each failed attempt further highlighted her overreach and lack of credibility. She began to retreat into frustration, realizing that the veteran's calm and strategic approach had effectively neutralized her influence. Her insistence on using intimidation and exaggeration could not match the veteran's patient and factual methods. The veteran also continued to reinforce community understanding of rules and procedures. He quietly shared guidance on fair practices and clarified misunderstandings when asked. He did not dominate conversations or force his opinions, but he provided clarity and insight that helped the neighborhood function more smoothly. Residents began to rely on his advice, recognizing that his knowledge was both practical and impartial. This subtle influence helped reduce conflicts and promoted a more cooperative atmosphere, even among those who had not been directly involved in the dispute. In addition, the veteran maintained a low profile regarding his national HOA involvement. Few neighbors knew the full extent of his influence, and he preferred to keep it that way. He believed that respect and authority were best earned through actions, not by highlighting one's power. His experience with HOAs across the country gave him an understanding of rules, governance, and fairness that many local residents could not fully grasp. But the results of his guidance spoke for themselves. He had shown that knowledge, patience, and preparation could resolve conflicts far more effectively than aggression or ego. The woman, increasingly isolated, made a few last attempts to challenge him through informal channels. She tried small acts of intimidation, hoping to provoke a reaction, but the veteran remained calm and methodical. He responded only when necessary, always with facts and without emotional reaction. Each interaction further exposed the contrast between her impulsive behavior and his strategic patience. Neighbors noticed the difference, reinforcing their respect for him and their skepticism of her motives. The veteran's approach also set an example for the neighborhood. Residents saw that conflicts could be resolved without drama, that fairness required careful attention, and that patience often achieved what force could not. His handling of the situation became a quiet lesson in leadership, demonstrating that true authority was rooted in knowledge, integrity, and thoughtful action. The neighborhood began to function more smoothly, with residents more mindful of rules and each other's rights, and less influenced by attempts at intimidation or aggression. As the weeks turned into months, the veteran's reputation solidified. He was recognized not only as a veteran who had served his country, but also as someone who upheld fairness and integrity in his community. The woman, meanwhile, struggled to regain influence, realizing that her previous tactics were ineffective and counterproductive. Her repeated attempts to assert control had only highlighted the veteran's strategic calmness and strengthened his position among neighbors. Through it all, the veteran remained humble. He continued his routines, tending his garden, enjoying quiet moments on the porch, and interacting politely with neighbors. He had achieved a quiet but powerful victory, resolving a challenging situation without confrontation, anger, or intimidation. His strategy, patience, and commitment to fairness had ensured that truth and integrity prevailed, leaving a lasting impression on the neighborhood. Residents had learned that calm, thoughtful action, grounded in knowledge and respect for rules, could overcome aggression and ego, and that true authority often comes quietly, through consistent and fair behavior. The woman, having lost credibility in the neighborhood, became increasingly desperate. She realized that her previous tactics of intimidation, complaints, and rumors had failed, and she began to look for more drastic measures to regain control. She decided to call a large neighborhood meeting, thinking that if she could publicly confront the veteran, she might sway opinion in her favor. She hoped that a dramatic presentation would force the residents to see him as someone who disregarded rules, not realizing that she was stepping into a situation far beyond her understanding. On the day of the meeting, the room was filled with curious neighbors. Some were skeptical of the woman's intentions, having observed her behavior over weeks and months. Others were simply interested in seeing how the veteran would handle another challenge. The air was tense, charged with anticipation. The woman began her speech loudly, accusing him of breaking rules and attempting to disrupt the community. She tried to make it appear that her actions were in the interest of fairness, but her tone and aggressive style betrayed her frustration and lack of evidence. The veteran remained calm, standing quietly as she presented her points. When it was his turn, he did not respond with anger or accusation. He spoke with clarity and patience, addressing each of her claims with documented facts and precise explanations. He referred to the HOA rules and guidelines, showing how he had consistently followed every regulation. He included records of her complaints, letters, and interactions, demonstrating a clear pattern of harassment rather than genuine concern. His calm demeanor and methodical approach drew the attention of everyone in the room, creating a stark contrast with the woman's agitation. As the veteran explained the rules and demonstrated the evidence, the neighbors began to shift their perspective. They could see that he had acted with fairness, integrity, and patience, while the woman's accusations were based on personal vendettas rather than any real violations. His explanation was clear, concise, and focused entirely on facts, leaving little room for misinterpretation. Neighbors who had been unsure or hesitant began to nod in agreement, recognizing the veteran's wisdom and understanding. The woman grew visibly frustrated, her voice rising in an attempt to regain control. But the veteran's calm presence and factual approach left her arguments falling flat. He did not interrupt her, he did not mock her, and he did not escalate the situation. Instead, he allowed the facts to speak for themselves. The contrast between her aggression and his composed strategy was apparent to everyone. The more she tried to push, the more her credibility diminished. By the time he finished, the room was filled with quiet acknowledgement of his integrity and leadership. After the meeting, the HOA board took swift action. They reviewed the veteran's documentation and the woman's complaints, confirming that she had acted outside the rules and had engaged in harassment. They issued formal warnings to her, emphasizing that repeated behavior of this kind would result in fines and possible legal action. The veteran's adherence to the rules and his calm, methodical handling of the situation had not only protected him, but also reinforced fairness and proper governance within the community. The board's recognition further strengthened his position and discouraged the woman from future attempts at intimidation. In the days following the meeting, the neighborhood atmosphere began to change. Residents who had previously been cautious or uncertain now openly expressed their respect for the veteran. They admired his ability to handle a challenging situation with patience and integrity, and they began to seek his advice on other minor disputes or questions regarding the HOA rules. Children observed his routine of tending the garden, greeting neighbors politely and calmly engaging with the community, learning from his example about the power of patience, respect, and consistency. The woman, meanwhile, struggled to maintain influence. Her previous tactics had been rendered ineffective, and her attempts to regain authority only highlighted her overreach. Neighbors quietly distanced themselves from her efforts, recognizing that her actions were driven by ego rather than a genuine concern for fairness or community well-being. Each failed attempt at control reinforced the perception that she was no longer a credible authority figure within the neighborhood. The veteran continued his daily routines, unaffected by her attempts at intimidation. He tended to his garden, enjoyed his morning coffee, and engaged in thoughtful conversations with neighbors. He did not flaunt his influence or achievements, preferring to maintain a quiet presence that spoke volumes through action rather than words. His calm and strategic approach had not only resolved the immediate conflict, but also set a lasting example for how challenges could be addressed through patience, preparation, and fairness. Residents began to notice subtle improvements in the community. Disputes that had previously escalated quickly were now handled more thoughtfully, guided by the veteran's example. People were more willing to communicate calmly, check facts, and consider fairness before reacting. The neighborhood's sense of harmony and respect for rules strengthened, creating an environment where cooperation became the norm rather than conflict. The veteran's influence, though quiet, had created meaningful change that extended beyond his own property. The woman, increasingly isolated, made occasional attempts to challenge him or assert authority, but these efforts were largely ignored. The community had recognized the pattern of her behavior, and her previous failures had eroded the support she once hoped to rally. She became a cautionary example of how aggression and overreach could backfire. While the veteran's patience and strategic actions had solidified his position as a respected figure within the neighborhood, Throughout this period, the veteran maintained his humility. He did not boast about his accomplishments or use his influence to dominate others. Instead, he focused on living with integrity, following the rules, and providing guidance when requested. His approach emphasized that true leadership and authority were built through consistent, fair, and thoughtful actions, rather than aggression or intimidation. Neighbors began to internalize this lesson, observing how calm, patient, and knowledgeable behavior could resolve conflicts effectively. The veteran also continued to strengthen his understanding of local and national HOA policies. He reviewed guidelines, consulted with experienced colleagues, and ensured that any potential issues could be addressed proactively. This preparation allowed him to respond effectively to any future challenges, though he rarely needed to act because the woman's influence had diminished significantly. His quiet vigilance ensured that fairness and proper governance were upheld, creating a stable and respectful environment within the neighborhood. As months passed, the veteran's reputation continued to grow. Residents admired his ability to navigate complex situations with patience and clarity. They recognized that his actions had prevented unnecessary conflict, reinforced the importance of fairness, and provided a model for how disputes could be resolved effectively. The woman, meanwhile, struggled to regain credibility or influence, understanding that her previous tactics had not only failed, but had also strengthened the veteran's standing within the community. The veteran's influence extended beyond just resolving conflicts. He quietly advised neighbors on minor disputes, clarified rules when questions arose, and helped maintain a sense of order without creating additional tension. His calm, methodical approach became a stabilizing force in the neighborhood, ensuring that fairness, respect, and cooperation remained the foundation of community life. Children, adults, and elderly residents alike began to recognize the value of thoughtful action, patience, and integrity, learning from the veteran's example in subtle but meaningful ways. Ultimately, the woman's attempts at control had only highlighted the veteran's strengths. His strategic, patient, and fair approach had not only protected him from harassment, but had also reinforced the principles of integrity and proper governance within the community. The neighborhood had learned an important lesson. True authority was not established through intimidation, aggression, or ego, but through knowledge, preparation, and calm, thoughtful action. The veteran had shown that even in the face of persistent challenges, fairness and patience could achieve results that force and anger never could. By the end of this period, the neighborhood had largely returned to a state of calm. Residents felt more secure, understanding that rules were enforced fairly and that personal conflicts could be addressed thoughtfully. The veteran's influence remained quietly pervasive, guiding the community through example rather than command. The woman's power had diminished, and her attempts to assert control were now largely ignored or dismissed. Through patience, strategy, and integrity, the veteran had not only defended himself but had also left a lasting impact on the neighborhood, demonstrating the power of calm, thoughtful leadership.